spending more than 4 years trying to make sense of how Google makes sense of us. Kind of tired of talking about Google. And I mean, I'm also frustrated by the ways that many people discuss issues pertaining to the effects of digital technologies on the world. And so what I have for you today is something largely grumpy and incomplete, right? And so it comes from frustration with this sort of watching and reading how people have been talking about things, mostly for the last 2 years. It got my annoyance was particularly acute in the spring, Arab or not, and you'll see why. But I think the roots are deeper. I think we've gotten into some bad habits in terms of how we discuss digital technologies, and one of the chief problems I see is this concept of the internet. And so you'll see if I'm onto something, you might agree with me that this term does more harm than good, distracts us more than reveals what's going on in the world, the variety of things going on in the world. So let me just march through. Now, for the past few years, we've seen a number of works come out trying to describe the deep social, political, and cultural effects of digital technologies. And all of them seem to be framed around this notion that there is a cohesive phenomenon that we generally call the internet. And I'm as guilty as anyone of participating in this. So I didn't get too worried about this idea until very recently. You might argue too late. But of course, we've seen just in the past year some remarkable changes, some remarkable things happen in the real world. And I think to many of our annoyance, we have seen it ascribed to the gadgets, right? Ascribed to all of these phenomena ascribed to the platforms, with very little attention paid to the people who actually put their bodies in the way of hard things, put their lives on the line, risked career and family to make a difference in the world. Instead, we've been dazzled by what I call techno-narcissism, right? So it's real easy for those of us who live in this comfortable part of the world, who are surrounded by these gadgets, who are so familiar with these gadgets, who spend so many hours per day staring at these screens, to suddenly be able to look up and say, oh my goodness, the thing I do 8 to 10 hours a day is changing the world. How great am I, right? That's techno-narcissism. And I saw it everywhere this spring, and it was deeply troubling. That's not to say that these tools were not helpful, perhaps even essential. But I would trust the people who actually used the tools to make that judgment rather than those who sat far, far away staring at their screens, very proud of themselves that they retweeted everything from Cairo, right? That's not action, right? And we've been operating for a long time. We, by when I say we, I mean cosmopolitan, educated elites in the West who are immersed in these sorts of screens and boxes. We've been imagining that what we were building, or at least hoping what we were building and participating in, was some sort of public square, if not public sphere. Pick your shape. Regardless, it's pretty clear that that's not what we were doing. It's pretty clear that at this point, by 2011, we are essentially trying to hold a rally in a Starbucks. Now, if you want to hold a rally in a public square, by all means, hold a rally in a public square. People seem to do it rather well these days. The challenge, though, the problem I have is this conflation, right? This idea that these fora, these platforms, which are essentially privately managed spaces, can somehow serve the interest of public deliberation in the way that we idealize, right? In the way that we talk about some of the more famous and honored public squares. So we are stuck in the Starbucks. Nothing wrong with Starbucks, right? Well, a few things wrong with Starbucks, but, you know, there are worse places. But it's not a park, it's not a library, it's not the town square. We've also seen, of course, in a rather acute way, an anarchistic reaction to a lot of the activity going on in the techno-political arena. We've seen people finally, in sort of the mainstream deliberations, we've seen people finally pay attention to troublemakers, right? Cyber anarchists who are willing to disrupt, sometimes in a humorous way, sometimes in a not so humorous way, a variety of activities around the web. But we've also seen some very sincere efforts by global civil society institutions who are trying to use the advantages of digital technologies. They're trying to lower the barriers of entry. They're trying to increase the speed of communication. They're trying to harness enthusiasm and maintain enthusiasm in the least expensive way, which is the precise way one should approach these new technologies, which some of which aren't so new anymore. Many of them are also, of course, extremely concerned with making sure that the people on the ground in troublesome parts of the world can maintain their anonymity to avoid being captured and brutally tortured. And so we've seen a remarkable amount of innovation and activity by these global civil society groups, and I think it's quite inspiring and enlightening. But we have not seen the rise of any sort of Republican culture on the net. You know, we've seen a lot of radical democracy, and we've seen a lot of corporatism, and we've seen odd blends of radical democracy and corporatism. But we haven't really seen a culture of deliberation or a culture of rational discourse. Not that we should necessarily expect it. I'm not sure we've ever had it, right? But nonetheless, this was part of the promise expressed by certain early polemicists about the web. We've also seen in the past year efforts to rein in some of the, what some would say, the more troublesome aspects of global digital culture. So President Sarkozy has, at the G8 meeting in the spring or in June, urged a pretty high level of global regulation on internet activity. Specifically, he's concerned with copyright infringement. That's probably his number one concern. As so often happens when there's a moral panic about copyright infringement, one has to attach other values to it, like fears about pornography and fears about privacy violations and so forth. So he wants to explore, at least a G8 sense, an effort to rein in what he sees as troublesome expressions. Of course, to rein in troublesome expressions in France is to use the same technologies and same devices and same moves that rein in basic calls for reform or religion or democracy in places like China. Now, once, of course, Sarkozy presented this vision, which had so many problems and was not well thought out, the reaction from activists, the reaction from companies like Facebook and Google and eBay and Amazon, and the reactions from members who were representing the United States government all seem to echo this phrase: don't regulate the internet. We heard this time and time again. Don't regulate the internet, President Sarkozy. Right? And there were conferences and panels held in Paris trying to shake the French government out of this idea of regulating the internet. Meanwhile, over here on this side of the Atlantic, which we're actually 2 oceans away, right? We've been fighting, many of us have been fighting for some basic regulations that would ensure that internet service providers cannot discriminate based on the source of packets of information, right? So they can't decide that CNN.com video can arrive faster than Fox.com video, that YouTube won't be held back with some sort of extortion-like pricing system. More importantly, that the next video platform, the video platform not yet owned by a major wealthy corporation, can compete for the ability to reach viewers. It's also a major concern for Microsoft because Microsoft just bought Skype. And one of the first things that major American telecom companies would love to do once they're confident enough that net neutrality is no more is dial down the quality of Skype, because Skype, of course, is a direct competitor for their voice platforms. Meanwhile, so while many of us are fighting to establish these baseline rules through either legislation or through FCC action, we hear this refrain, most often from libertarians, but as so often happens with libertarian think tanks funded by the internet service providers, and they are basically saying, don't regulate the internet. Many of the same people who are arguing for network neutrality in the United States are arguing against Sarkozy's vision of a highly overregulated internet in the G8. And we hear this refrain again and again and again. Don't regulate the internet. And this is sort of baffling, because what do you mean by regulate? And we generally think of regulation as something that comes from the state, but in the real world, right, in pragmatic terms, that's absurd. Because I find my interaction with digital technologies constantly regulated by either AT&T, which provides the service to my phone, or Comcast, which provides the service to my home. And many times, AT&T and Comcast actually fail to provide that service, but that's another story. Right? So where's the regulation here, right? Comcast has already shown that it's willing to discriminate based on the source of certain packets. It's been caught time and time again doing this. AT&T has been pushing to make sure that nothing close to network neutrality comes through as a principle in the mobile data service world. All right? So they are regulating my experience, whether it's the internet or not, right? They are heavily regulating in a way that offers me no terms, right? I can't negotiate the terms of exchange here. I can pay more. That's the only level of negotiation. And even then, there's a ceiling upon which that I can reach, right? So what do we mean by regulate? Well, so this very notion that there was ever an unregulated thing called an internet is absurd. Right? The internet was created by states. It was the innovation that went to the basic code and structures and protocols were funded by the states, various states around the world. The work was done in many ways by both the U.S. Defense Department and by major universities around the world. But this was a state activity from the beginning. And in the early 1990s, the Clinton administration, in the United States at least, decided that there would be some level of deregulation. In other words, the state would have less and less to say about what would go on in this space. And the theory was this would unleash a tremendous amount of creativity. Well, that happened, whether it was because of the deregulation is, I think, something we can argue for many decades. Whether we chose the right mode of deregulation or the right mode of regulation, I think is something worthy of discussion. But we didn't go from 100 to 0 on the regulation scale in the 1990s. Other countries around the world, of course, took very different paths to establishing networks of digital communication. Right? China, of course, has its own model. France has a very different model. Anyone here ever use Minitel? Mm-hmm. Right? So. Yeah, finally they put it to bed. But it was, it's been active for, what, since 78, something like that, right? This notion that it would be very much along the model of a state-run telecom corporation, that digital electronic communication would go through this standardized box over standardized networks and would serve the citizens, right? That was an interesting model. It was, I think, terrifically influential. It changed a lot of minds. It opened up a lot of questions. It didn't ultimately end up prevailing as the model, but it was a nice experiment. So, countries around the world tried different things. British Telecom did its own thing in large ways. The British model was in concert with the U.S. model. Nonetheless, at no point did we talk about a deregulated space. We've always had laws, whether those were copyright laws, enforceable or not, or obscenity laws, privacy laws, right? Just that some states did their laws differently than other states, and some of these laws were more enforceable than others, and some of them made sense, some of them, but there was no fantastic utopia of libertarianism. But the other part of that sentence, don't regulate the internet, should raise some other questions. What do you mean by the internet, right? When I'm using an iPhone through AT&T's network, and I'm using the app that the New York Times supplies, right? Am I actually using the internet as we have come to be accustomed, right? It's an internet-like activity, right? The fact that the same device can give me access to my email means there's something internet-y going on there. But if I'm using an app to watch Netflix, or I'm using an app to read the New York Times, am I using the internet in that classic sense? Well, the data is flowing over AT&T's proprietary network, right? Along terms set by AT&T, engineered by AT&T. It's certainly, this data at some point flows through what you might think of as internet classic nodes, right? It flows through data pipes that regular internet traffic flows through. It gets routed in similar ways, but it doesn't necessarily have to end up that way. It's just that's kind of how it is today. But it might not be forever, right? If these boxes become less and less important to our lives, and these Wi-Fi radio signals become less and less important, and we end up moving more and more of these digital activities to tightly controlled proprietary networks like AT&T, like British Telecom, like T-Mobile or Deutsche Telekom, we are not necessarily engaging in the same sorts of networks as we've assumed, right? So what do we mean by the internet? I mean, when we talk about my phone, am I really talking about internet communication? I'm not convinced. I think in many ways we're talking about internet-like or internet simulations, but not always, right? So what I'd like to introduce this idea that the internet is a dream. It's a dream we've never had. I mean, we've never realized. It's a dream that's far off. It's not a bad dream. It's actually a nice vision for global standardization of communication, for openness, for customizability, for all of those cool, hippie open source ideas that have made such a difference, right? They have made a difference with the vision of the internet, and they certainly have contributed to so many of these different technological platforms. But going forward, we don't necessarily see those models triumphing, right? But it's still always been an aspiration. So how did we get to this point where our rhetoric about digital communication doesn't seem to match what's actually going on in our networks? Well, I have a few places to look for blame. One is the idea of internet exceptionalism. Now, internet exceptionalism is the notion that rules are different on the internet. Everything's different on the internet. We are different on the internet, right? And this plays very well into the libertarian fantasy, right? This idea that, you don't need to import your copyright rules. You don't need to import your obscenity regulations. You don't need to impose sales tax on sales done over the internet. Those sorts of ideas have their roots in this notion of internet exceptionalism, right? That the internet is a special place. It's not necessarily part of the United States of America. It's not necessarily part of Egypt. It's not necessarily part of Indonesia. It is a special place, and it is an exceptional place. It's a lovely place, right? John Perry Barlow, who is one of the founders of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and for a long time a lyricist for the Grateful Dead, a brilliant man, a really kind-hearted man, a visionary man. He deserves the credit and the blame in many ways for this notion of talking about internet communications in this spatial way, because he was the first person to import from the world of science fiction the idea of cyberspace and apply it to this digital network that by the early 1990s was on the verge of being part of our lives, right? So, he's quite explicit about being the first person to write about this, instead of writing about cables connecting us, that there was this imagined space out there, this cyberspace. He wrote in 1996 a Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, in which he basically said, look, governments of the world, keep your laws out of this fabulous libertarian space of cyberspace. I've been teaching this declaration for decades now. Actually, it's for like 12 years now. And it gets a different reaction every year. These days, students just laugh at it. It just doesn't make sense to them, right? Back in the late 90s, it pretty much got applause. Everyone thought it totally made sense. It totally described their situation and the situation of how digital networks work. But of course, it doesn't really work today. And this very notion that there are citizens out there or activists who can declare independence from something for something else, right? It just doesn't map well. But it was really important for Barlow and the people who were early advocates of this notion of internet exceptionalism to sort of stake this out. Remember, the 1990s, what a wacky time, right? Peace, prosperity. Good thing that's all over. But you remember, in the 1990s, we also had this notion that we could see the end of authoritarianism, right? The end of totalitarianism. It was just a little while away because, look, all of these massive totalitarian models had collapsed, right? There was so much liberty. People were dancing in the streets, right? This was, and hey, I was subscribed to this too. This was an amazing moment, and it was hard not to say, wow, why did this happen now and not 10 years ago? Well, it must have been the fax machine. Right, the fax machine really, there were articles about that. The fax machine had been so important in Prague, and of course, if they had the fax machine in '68, things would have been different. Well, I don't know. It's tough to say, but there was also this notion that that there should be this creative space, there should be this fantasy space, where people can be completely free. And I think this was, in some ways, residue or a hangover from the Iron Curtain, from the Cold War. And so it was a deeply attractive notion, right? That while the real world worked itself out in terms of how to deal with various models of authoritarian or totalitarianism, at least cyberspace would be radically liberal. And in fact, radically free. Well, we also saw the rise of this idea of the World Wide Web, right? And this was worldwide. This wasn't just a web, right? This was a World Wide Web. So when Tim Berners-Lee came up with the basic mode, the basic protocols and named this thing the World Wide Web, it was such an attractive notion, right? That there would be this easy to use platform where anyone could publish, where anyone could link to anyone. And what an amazing thing to think about. And you could put images up there as well as text, right? A dual media form. Before anyone had thought about putting dogs on skateboards, we had thought about publishing and about sharing information in a global sense, in a worldwide sense. And because it didn't take long for the web to become the dominant, most obvious, most interesting part of internet activity, people started conflating the web and the internet quite quickly, right? Even though the internet describes the network of networks and includes a variety of different ways of sending data, right? It could be, email is different from the web, even though you can read your email on the web, for instance, right? So this conflation of internet and web soon followed, right? But also remember in the late 1990s, this image was ubiquitous. I think this image has done so much damage. Bad dog. No, and somebody quoted it yesterday in an article. I saw it like on some online forum, right? So it really doesn't go away. I've quoted it, and I think in my second book I quoted it, right? So this is a really fascinating text. On the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Well, actually, on the internet, everyone knows what kind of dog food you prefer, right? These days, this is so if there was a time when this level of anonymity was possible, it's long gone, right? On the internet is the construction I'm very much interested in, though. On the internet, what do we mean on the internet? Are we really on or off? Right now, are you on the internet or are you off the internet? Maybe? Aren't you here, though? Aren't you on Earth? Aren't you on the island of Oahu? Can you be both on the internet and the island of Oahu? I don't know, maybe, right? Certainly one's attention can be in multiple places, but one's attention could be in multiple places before you add this internet idea, right? Your mind could be elsewhere. We've used constructions like that. My mind was on Oahu when I actually was in Kansas, right? That happens all the time to people in Kansas who visit Oahu. But on the internet, right? So this became, not just because of this cartoon, I mean, the cartoon certainly reflected the idea that one would go from some place to another place and be on the internet, right? You could be on the road, and maybe that had a lot to do with it. Remember also in the 1990s we had this idea that we were dealing with an information superhighway. That was Al Gore's phrase, right? When he sort of ran the Clinton administration's vision of internet policy. He said, this will, because he kept striving for ways to explain to Americans what they were about to experience in their lives. And so he chose the information superhighway. Because, of course, the state had built superhighways for reasons no one can quite explain. We have an interstate highway in Hawaii. Nonetheless, right, and that was a major public works program. There's also one in Alaska too, which doesn't you would think they would at least try to connect those two. But,
the bridge to nowhere.
Yeah, right. So this the people were really struggling for metaphors in the 1990s. Fortunately, we've abandoned the information superhighway, right? But we still have this notion of cyberspace. Cyberspace actually won out as a metaphor for information superhighway. I actually think information superhighway, because it actually focuses on the infrastructure, gives you perhaps a more accurate sense of what's going on here, right? Because we tend to forget about the cables, right? We forget about the infrastructure. And this is one of the things that, I kept reminding myself and other people when I was working on the Google book, like Google's not just a whole bunch of code and brilliant people working in a bunch of buildings in Mountain View. It is billions of dollars of sunken infrastructure. It is air conditioners and servers and fiber optic cable and just racks and racks of metal and concrete. And it's an awesome idea. If anyone would ever let me near a server farm, I'm sure I'd be awed by it. But we don't get to see that, right? The awesomeness of the infrastructure is hidden, which is why information superhighway didn't quite catch on. But cyberspace, that's something we can put our minds in, right? So one thing is this persistent idea that you can actually hide one's identity and pretend to be some other species is interesting. Secondly, notice the way this dog is living, and ask yourself if this is still how you live, right? At some point, the dog entered the room and trotted across the room and got into a specific chair at a specific desk and logged on, right, which brings that on thing, to this system, right? Actually turned it on, waited for it to boot up, which guessing Windows 95, 7 minutes, right? And then it booted up, and then the dog had to, I don't know, remember trumpet windsock, right? Or whatever the protocol was at the time to like get the modem to click on and dial CompuServe, right? All of that had to happen here. And so we're talking about a specific place in one's house or apartment where one would go, or office, where one would go to engage in these activities, right? And so you had to actually take time out of your day to move into a new place and sort of move everything else out of the way and connect. And each of these was a deliberate step, right? The deliberation that went on at every step, I think, was an important cultural process and gave us this idea, I am now about to go somewhere else. Like I've entered the transporter on the Starship Enterprise, and I'm going somewhere else, right? That's a very attractive notion. But this doesn't necessarily reflect how we live today, right? Because today, it's about constant connectivity. Now, not everywhere in the world and not every way, but if you think about the modes of digital communication in sub-Saharan Africa, it does not look like this, right? It looks a lot more like this, right? Although it'll be a Nokia rather than an Apple phone, right? And but even that, the operating system is changing pretty rapidly, and all sorts of new tools are being embedded in these rather small, light machines with very efficient batteries. So this is already so archaic, and yet the language we use doesn't quite make sense of this way of being constantly connected to digital networks. And then there's the embeddedness, right? This was in my pocket the whole time, right? I actually feel, oh, I better put it back in my pocket. I need it. I need it next to my skin, right? I have to have it here. I don't know what it's doing to my genitals, but it's here, you know? and it's embedded in my life. It's like, you know, if I'm at a bus stop, I'm whipping it out and checking on stuff, and oh, someone had to have liked my last post to Facebook, right? This embeddedness, this notion of this, you know, my friend Cory Doctorow, whose picture I had up earlier, he had this great talk about how Facebook is a huge Skinner box, which because it trains us to seek affirmation for the smallest little thing, right? I'm going to tell a joke on Facebook and then check back every half an hour to see who liked it, you know? And this, like, every like is like a little drug, right? And it just conditions us to share more. It conditions us to tell people stupid things. Sometimes it conditions us to tell people profound things, but, you know, we get likes for some of the stupid, right? You've probably noticed that some of the stupidest things you put up, people love, and when you have a really deep thought, people totally ignore it. Anyway, but the embeddedness of digital media is something we haven't quite come to terms with. I think researchers have, right? This room, we're good with this. We understand that the embeddedness of digital media in our lives is the story right now. It's something that really we're desperate to make sense of, right? The notion of constant connectivity is something we have to make sense of. But it doesn't track well with this notion of the internet being a separate space. But also remember the diversity of experiences with digital media, the fractured experiences, right? So in sub-Saharan Africa, there is someone not encountering digital media the way that dog is. There's someone not encountering digital media the way I am. There's someone encountering digital media in a completely different way. It might be on a $100 laptop with a crank. Probably not. That ended up failing. But, you know, somebody has those $100 laptops. It might be someone who's on a Nokia phone, running a small business off of a Nokia phone, keeping accounts, texting orders, and so forth, right? Or it might be a family just keeping track of itself through its Nokia phones. There are all these different multiple experiences of digital media that do not actually meld well in some general sense of digital communication. And I don't think we've fully taken into account the diversity of digital media experiences around the world. Here I am telling a room which is about 1/3 ethnographers this, and you're saying, who do you mean? What are you talking about? This is all I do, right? Because actually that's the thing. Ethnographers and anthropologists of digital media are so on top of this stuff, right? They're the ones who are actually been saying for a decade now, what do you mean internet, right? It doesn't matter about this cyberspace thing. What matters is what happens in people's daily lives. How people create and forge symbols in their daily lives using these things, and how they create community and kinship and all this cool stuff that anthropologists have been thinking about for hundreds of years, and now they have a whole new set of data to work with, right? So there's nothing new here to an anthropologist, thank goodness. And so that's actually, I think, the wisdom we need to take from this, right? It's about the diversity of experience. But when I say fractured, I also mean that we should be paying attention to borders. We should recognize that the experience of digital media in China, which, as I said yesterday, a place I've never been, cannot possibly look and feel like the digital immersion experience here in Hawaii, right? That in China, where there is a conference going on right now, although they're probably sleeping right now, but like these days, that looks and feels kind of like this. What's going on with the boxes in front of them may be somewhat like what we're doing, but it can't be completely like what we're doing. And the differences are very important. And the differences are functions of policy, but they're also functions of culture. They're functions of expectations. They're functions of commerce. And those details get lost. Those details get lost in these big meta-analyses of the internet. So what are the implications here? The implications of talking about the internet incessantly. And look, I use the phrase the internet all the time, right? I mean, it's not like since I thought this stuff up, I've stopped using the phrase, right? It's not a bad word. But I just think we should be cautious about it. I think we should be cautious about it because we don't always, it's a convenient phrase, but it doesn't fully capture what we're dealing with. And I think as scholars, it's really important that we actually avoid the phrase unless it's really necessary. Sometimes it's necessary in the cover of a book. It may not necessarily be necessary inside of a book. But internet exceptionalism, which I think is related to the idea of the internet being a the internet, is a very dangerous idea. I think the implications are actually not positive at all. One of the implications is the inability to recognize challenges and opportunities in digital media in its full diversity, right? Because focusing on the internet, as we did in this country among internet scholars, there's an Association for Internet Research, right? I go to it every year, right? But we were focusing on the internet, on these big boxes that those dogs were using, right? And what we missed was, for instance, the uprising in the Philippines in 1998 using SMS as a major means of communication and activism, right? Oh my gosh, SMS texting matters in the world to Americans in 1998. That was wacky. Who texted in the United States in 1998? Almost nobody. And yet the rest of the world seemed to have been quite hip to it. And because we focused on the internet, that surprised us, right? That didn't quite make sense to us. We also, I think, tend to ignore the diversity even within the United States, the diversity of devices, the diversity of activities, the diversity of needs and wants, especially when class comes into it. The second implication would be a comforting yet false assumption about the essential nature of internet freedom. Whenever there's a digital policy debate about something like network neutrality, libertarians pipe up, you really have nothing to worry about. You're just being a pessimist because the market will work itself out. The internet is necessarily free. And you've probably heard that phrase that just makes me so mad. Information wants to be free, right? Oh, what a horrible, horrible idea, right? As if information can want anything, right? As if that matters, even if information wanted to be free, right? I mean, come on. Prisoners want to be free too. They're still prisoners, right? So, but this idea that the technology will take care of itself, right? That the internet is is designed to be radically free, and there's nothing you can do about it. That what's the other phrase that comes from Gilmore, one of the other founders of the EFF? That the internet routes around censorship. Really? Well, there are a lot of people in Burma who would be surprised to learn that the internet routes around censorship. So, so this notion that the essential nature of the technology is fixed and tends toward freedom, and so we don't have to worry about it, I think is a really troublesome idea. And then there are the unfounded assumptions about universality, right? And again, this sort of this comfort level that we have in the United States, because we have a remarkably free set of environments to communicate. Very few legal restrictions, and even many of the legal restrictions are not well enforced. We tend to assume that the rest of the world is operating under these sorts of nice things. And so when we idealize things like cultural creativity in the digital world, we tend to forget that we're dealing with a whole variety of different environments, and we should be paying attention to specifics. And the thing that really gets me, and I think the essence of my discomfort with this way of talking about digital media, is the inability to confront serious policy challenges. And this gets back to things like net neutrality and copyright and obscenity and all sorts of other policy challenges, some of which are serious and some of which are merely red herrings. But the fact is we've been unable to have a serious policy discussion about how we might build, maintain, and extend a digital environment that, or a digital ecosystem that might foster creativity and might foster human freedom and might foster something like dignity and justice. That conversation has not happened because, first of all, we took for granted the fact that the internet would just solve these things, right? And secondly, that we haven't fully understood the work that has to be done, right? So part of what really irked me about the idealization of the role that digital technologies played in the Arab Spring was, well, I mean, the thing that really got me, of course, was that we weren't paying attention to the real human stories that were truly amazing and inspirational. But the second thing that got me was this notion that the work is done, right? That, oh my gosh, if we can just get Facebook into other oppressive areas, it'll all be over, right? And then like people in Syria are going, hey, we have Facebook here, but we're getting slaughtered by our governments, right? It's not helping. And the fact is, that wasn't the work that needed to be done. You know, when it came to Egypt, for instance, the most amazing thing is the Mubarak government was so clueless about how to monitor and exploit Facebook. It could have used Facebook against all of these demonstrators months earlier. Could have tricked them into showing up in the wrong place at the wrong time and all been rounded up. They could have been much more brutal than they were. But they were really dumb, right? The Mubarak security forces were just not very sharp. That's a one-off thing. That's not going to happen again, as we see in Syria now, right? As we saw in Bahrain. This was a particular accident of history and not part of a grand movement of history. But we've not been able to actually have the sort of discussion that could yield a real vision and a real plan for a sort of global communication system, a real internet. We could build an internet if we wanted it. Maybe we don't want it. I mean, there's a good chance that a lot of us don't want it. I don't think Sarkozy wants it. I know that Mubarak doesn't want it. But some of us might want it. But let's not pretend we already have it. Let's figure out how to get it if we want it. And let's start real political activism to make sure that we can build this sort of thing. So that's what I'll leave you with. Thanks very much for listening.